In 1811, in the British Virgin Islands in the Caribbean, a slave system had been established and maintained for centuries, affecting thousands of kidnapped Africans forced into labor. This was not a random occurrence, but the result of colonial policy and a plantation economy based on the exploitation of unpaid labor. Today, we will analyze this system from historical and sociological perspectives to understand the development of legal consciousness and human rights, as well as draw important lessons for protecting human rights in the modern world. The Arthur Hodge case marked a significant turning point in legal history. The first time a white plantation owner was tried and sentenced to death for murdering an enslaved person. If you are interested in learning history to build a fairer future for all, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Historical knowledge helps us identify and prevent similar injustices in the present. To understand why slavery could exist and thrive in the Caribbean, we need to examine the context of the 18th and early 19th centuries. According to Professor David Barry Gaspar of Duke University in his work Bondmen and Rebels, this period was defined by three main factors. First, politically, the British Empire was expanding its global influence and viewed the Caribbean colonies as important sources of revenue. Islands like Tortola, Virgin Gorda, and Anegada were considered highly valuable for their production of sugar, rum, and other agricultural goods. The colonial governance system created both legal and geographical distance between the seat of power in London and life on the plantations, allowing practices that would be deemed illegal in Britain itself. Second, society was structured along rigid racial hierarchies. Records from the UK National Archives show that colonial society was divided into distinct strata: free whites at the top, free people of color in the middle, and enslaved people at the bottom. This structure was reinforced by law, religion, and cultural norms, creating deep inequalities in power and legal status. Third, the plantation economy relied entirely on slave labor. According to research by Michael Creighton on Caribbean history, in the early 19th century, about 90% of the Virgin Islands population were enslaved. This system generated massive profits for plantation owners and British trading companies, creating a powerful economic incentive to maintain slavery. These conditions created an environment where exploitation and abuse could flourish without meaningful challenge from legal or social institutions. Importantly, the Caribbean slave system was not unique. At the same time, similar models existed elsewhere. In South Carolina and Georgia, the plantation systems for rice and cotton relied on slavery on a similar scale. In Brazil, particularly in Bahia and Pernambuco, sugar plantations employed even larger numbers of African slaves than the Caribbean. In Cuba and Haiti, before the 1791 revolution, slavery had similar structures and brutality. This demonstrates that slavery was a product of the global economic system and the colonial policies of European powers, not an anomaly of any single culture. Comparative research by Robin Blackburn in The Making of New World Slavery shows all these regions shared key traits: a tropical climate suitable for intensive agriculture, the presence of colonial powers, and access to the transatlantic slave trade network. In the Virgin Islands, slavery was legalized through a series of laws passed in London and local regulations. According to Elsa Gouvea's Slave Society in the British Leeward Islands, slave codes established from the 17th century declared that slaves were personal property of their owners, without legal rights, and could be bought, sold, inherited, or transferred like any other asset. The 1798 Virgin Islands Act explicitly granted owners the right to reasonable discipline of slaves, a vague term that created legal loopholes for abuse. However, it also stated that killing a slave without just cause was a criminal offense, though in practice this was almost never enforced. Religion's role in legitimizing slavery was complex. While some clergymen in Britain, such as William Wilberforce, campaigned against the slave trade, many local churches in the colonies justified the institution through biblical interpretation. sermons often emphasized natural order and obedience to God's will, as recorded in the London Missionary Society archives, showing how religion was sometimes used to uphold social injustice. Barbara Bush's Slave Women in Caribbean Society, published by Indiana University Press, describes the Caribbean slave system as highly structured and brutal. The selection process was driven by the transatlantic slave trade. Records show slaves were chosen based on age, health, and labor potential, with 2,000 to 3,000 Africans brought to the Virgin Islands each year during the trade's peak. This process was organized by trading companies like the Royal African Company and later private merchants, and followed a brutal chain from kidnapping in Africa to horrific Atlantic voyages to auction sales in Caribbean ports. Plantation operations, as detailed in Michael Creighton's Testing the Chains, ran from sunrise to sunset 6 days a week, primarily cultivating, harvesting, and processing sugar. The gang labor system divided slaves into work groups, overseen by white or free-colored overseers and slave drivers. Violations were punished with whippings, shackles, or other corporal penalties. British National Archives records show a complex power hierarchy on plantations. A white owner or manager at the top, supported by overseers, and below them trusted slaves serving as drivers supervising daily labor. This structure even created social stratification within the slave community itself. Historically, between 1672 and 1834, when slavery was abolished, around 200,000 Africans were brought to the Virgin Islands. Annual numbers ranged from 1,000 to 4,000, depending on labor demand and trade conditions. About 60% were concentrated in Tortola, 25% in Virgin Gorda, and 15% on smaller islands. Most were between 15 and 40 years old, about 70% of the total, the peak working age. Dr. David Eltis of Emory University notes, "These numbers reflect the vast scale and systematic nature of exploitation and the constant labor demand due to high mortality and harsh living conditions." The question arises, why did this system endure for so long without strong external opposition? Three main mechanisms explain this. Information control. Christopher Brown in Moral Capital shows that reports on plantation conditions rarely reach the British public. Geographic distance, censorship, and vested economic interests created a veil of silence around slavery. Official accounts, often written by those profiting from the system, tended to downplay or hide the brutality. Institutional protection, legal and political structures were dominated by plantation owners, who held key local government roles as lawmakers, judges, and administrators. This closed loop ensured those tasked with enforcing the law were the same people benefiting from the system. Broad economic interests. As Eric Williams argued in Capitalism and Slavery, slavery profits flowed beyond plantations to London banks, insurance companies, which insured slaves as property, shipping firms, and Manchester textile mills. This created a powerful lobbying network against reform. The impact of slavery was profound. Psychological. Joy de Gruy's post-traumatic slave syndrome shows slavery inflicted direct psychological harm through violence and dehumanization, with intergenerational trauma evident in behavior patterns, cultural adaptation, and family structures. Social. Families were routinely broken apart by sale, but slave communities developed adaptive strategies. Chosen families, informal support networks, and underground cultural systems. Cultural. Sidney Mintz and Richard Price's The Birth of African American Culture documents how slave communities created new Creole cultures, blending African, European, and indigenous elements in music, religion, language, and customs. Resistance existed across a spectrum from subtle acts to organized revolts. James C. Scott's concept of hidden transcripts describes everyday resistance, slow work, sabotage, poisoning livestock, escape. Literate or legally knowledgeable slaves often became organic intellectuals leading resistance. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, inspired hope across the Caribbean, showing that slaves could organize and win. Within this context, the 1811 Arthur Hodge case was a historic turning point. Hodge, a wealthy Tortola planter with hundreds of slaves, was notorious for extreme brutality. His trial and execution marked the first time in Caribbean history that a white plantation owner was held legally accountable for murdering a slave. Slavery in the British Caribbean ended in 1834 with the Abolition Act due to rising abolitionist pressure in Britain, Wilberforce, Clarkson, Equiano. The Hodge case became a propaganda symbol of slavery's inherent violence. Economic shifts making plantations less profitable, beet sugar, global competition, higher security costs. Frequent and large-scale slave uprisings, e.g., Jamaica 1831 to 1832, raising the political and economic cost of slavery. Parallels exist with later forced labor systems like the Soviet Gulag, and with modern slavery documented by the International Labour Organization, ILO, affecting an estimated 50 million people in 2022. Today's forced labor often hides behind complex legal structures and global supply chains, making accountability harder. Lessons from history include accountability and rule of law. Concentrated power without checks enables systemic exploitation. The Hodge case shows that even in oppressive systems, independent judiciary and rule of law can create breakthroughs. Information transparency. Controlling the narrative sustains injustice. Free press and access to information are essential. Community resilience. Grassroots support networks can protect vulnerable members, as slave communities did. As Dr. Orlando Patterson, Slavery and Social Death, notes, the Arthur Hodge case marked a moment when the legal system began recognizing the personhood of enslaved people, the result of long struggles by enslaved communities combined with changing economic and political conditions. Protecting human dignity requires constant vigilance and active participation from all members of society. From the Hodge case, we learn the importance of accountability and the rule of law in human rights protection, the power of information and public awareness to drive social change, the links between past and present in combating modern exploitation. History is not just to understand the past, but to build a fairer future. The Hodge case reminds us that justice is never automatic. It is the outcome of ongoing struggle and the courage of those who stand up for what is right. If this video helped you understand the importance of protecting human rights and remaining vigilant against exploitation, share it with others who care about building a fairer, more just world. Subscribe for more meaningful historical analysis so we can learn from the past to shape a better future. And tell me in the comments, what do you think is the most important lesson from today's story? How can we apply these insights to protect vulnerable people in our own communities? Thank you for taking the time to engage with this difficult but necessary topic. History teaches us that progress requires both understanding the past and a commitment to action in the present. See you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring vital lessons from history to build a better future for all.